My name was Richard Langley. 50 years ago, I took a man's life, and with it, destroyed my own future. I walked out of prison an old man, dressed in clothes that smelled of iron locks and the dust of corridors where other people's pain became your walls. They told me, forget it, move on. But I couldn't. I found the address of his daughter. I wasn't looking for forgiveness. I wanted only one thing, to tell her the truth, even if the door slammed in my face. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. The morning I stepped outside the gates of FCI Terre Haute, the sky was a washed-out gray, as if time itself had faded with the years I'd spent behind bars. The air smelled like dust and diesel. It had rained the night before, and the parking lot glistened under a thin layer of water that reflected the looming prison walls behind me. I didn't carry a suitcase, just a clear plastic bag containing a folded flannel shirt, a pair of reading glasses with one bent arm, and a letter I had rewritten countless times. I had served 50 years. I was 27 when I went in and 77 when I came out. My spine curved slightly to the left now, and my hands trembled even without the cold. I had no family waiting, no friends. No one knew I was walking free that day, and if they had, I doubted they would have cared. I had buried every connection in the dust of decades, and yet my body moved forward like it remembered how to walk in the real world, even when my soul lagged behind. The guards didn't say much. One gave me a nod, not out of kindness, but like someone passing off a duty. They handed me the same bag I'd brought in, a cracked leather belt, a rusted key that no longer opened anything, and a driver's license that had expired when Nixon was still in office. My picture on it looked like someone I barely remembered. My hair was black back then, eyes sharp, chin lifted. Now, what little hair I had was white and brittle, my skin loose around the jaw, and my eyes carried the weight of 50 winters. I squinted toward the road. A single bus stop stood at the edge of the highway, its bench eaten away by time. The only other man around was a janitor pushing a cart of cleaning supplies near the visitor entrance, humming to himself without looking at me. I walked slowly across the wet pavement. Each step echoed louder than it should have. I had dreamed of this moment, imagined what freedom might taste like. But standing there in damp shoes and an oversized coat that smelled like mothballs and cheap detergent, I didn't feel free. I felt stripped, like a man walking out of a photograph, left behind by the world that had turned digital while he'd been locked inside. I boarded the bus to Indianapolis without speaking a word. The driver didn't glance up when I handed him the crumpled ticket. I sat at the back, away from the others. The seat vibrated beneath me, and the windows shook with every bump in the road. Outside, cornfields blurred into shopping centers, then into rows of brick houses that looked too clean to belong in my memory. People stared at phones, tapped screens, wore earbuds, and moved their mouths without sound. I had read about these things in magazines, the world moving faster than any of us could follow. But it was another thing to see it, to sit among it, to feel how far I'd been left behind. In my lap, I held the envelope. Inside was the letter. I had rewritten it over and over during the last decade of my sentence. First it was an apology, then it became a confession, then it became something simpler, colder, sharper, truth without excuse. The paper had softened at the corners, rubbed smooth by my thumbs. I had memorized every word, but still read it each morning in my bunk, as if repetition might carve courage into me. The letter was never for the judge, never for parole. It was for her. Her name was Margaret Willoughby. She was 55 now, a nurse in a small town outside Lexington, Kentucky. I had found that out from a prison library database. Public records search, not illegal. Just available to those who knew how to look and had years to spend looking. Her name had changed after marriage, but the history followed. A daughter of the man I had killed. A girl who had been 7 when I ruined her life. A woman now, with a job that involved saving others, while I had only destroyed. I didn't know if she would open the door. I didn't know if she would scream or cry or slam it in my face. I didn't expect forgiveness. I had already buried any hope for that under the cold floor of my cell. What I wanted, what I needed, was to say the words out loud, not to unburden myself, not to find peace, but because a lie had lived too long in silence. And even if my voice shook and my knees failed, I would carry that truth to her doorstep. The bus hummed on. I watched the back of the driver's head bob slightly with each turn. At a stoplight, a mother and her child stood on the corner. The boy waved at the bus, and for a moment, I felt a flash of something like memory, of another child long ago, perhaps me, waving at something he didn't understand. I looked away. We pulled into the Indianapolis terminal just before noon. The sky remained stubbornly gray. I bought a coffee from a vending machine that spat it into a cardboard cup, lukewarm and bitter. I drank it anyway. It reminded me of prison brew, cheap, instant, over-sweetened, the kind that sits heavy in your gut but gives you a reason to keep sitting. I found a corner seat in the waiting area and laid the envelope across my lap again. I reread the first line. "My name is Richard Langley. I am the man who took your father's life." No flourishes, no softening, just the truth. I didn't know what time she got off work. I didn't know if she still lived in the same house, but I had a name, a street, and a bus route that could take me halfway there. The rest I would walk. I had walked in circles for 5 decades, counting tiles and steel bars and cracks in concrete. A few more miles on soft ground seemed almost too gentle. I had packed no luggage, carried no gifts, only that letter and the coat on my back. The coat was a donation from a halfway house charity. A tag inside read L, but it sagged around my shoulders. It smelled of another man's cologne and a faint trace of mothballs. I would have preferred the uniform. At least it had fit. I waited for the afternoon bus. The station was louder now. People shouting into phones, suitcases rolling across linoleum. A girl cried nearby, and her mother handed her a juice box. I closed my eyes. Behind my eyelids, I could still see the pale light of my cell, the way it looked at dawn, before the first count. I could still feel the weight of the bars when I gripped them and stared out into nothing. When the bus arrived, I boarded with a steady hand. I was not a man seeking redemption. I was not a man worthy of grace. I was a man holding a letter he should have written 49 years earlier, and I was finally ready to deliver it. The letter had lived in my pocket for so long that it felt like part of my body. Folded neatly into thirds, wrapped in a plastic sandwich bag for protection, it bore the soft creases of hundreds of rereadings and silent revisions. The ink had faded a little, smudged by the oils of my skin, but the words had not changed. They could not change. I had written them with the slow determination of a man who had nothing else left to shape. Not a sentence in that letter was designed to absolve me. It was not a cry for help, not a poetic lament. It was a knife I meant to place carefully on the table, blade up, handle turned away. Let her choose what to do with it. In prison, time moves strangely. It can feel suspended, slow, like thick syrup, but the mind sharpens in that stillness, especially in long-term confinement. I used to lie awake on my bunk, staring at the ceiling, and construct the letter in my head word by word. I whispered it into the darkness, memorized it like a prayer, rewrote it with my breath. Each version grew colder, more exact. At first I begged, then I explained, but eventually all of that stripped away, and what remained was a skeleton of truth. Bones, nothing more. When they allowed us to keep paper and pencil in our cells, I started writing the first draft. I asked the library assistant, a kid named Joel, for envelopes. He always gave me one more than I requested. I think he knew I was preparing something heavier than correspondence. I would sit on the edge of my bunk when the block was quiet and write a sentence, then stare at it for hours. One line. That's all it took to ruin a day. I remember the way his head turned when I entered the room. That sentence haunted me for years, not because of what followed, but because of the detail I could never forget, the movement, so ordinary and irreversible. That turn was the moment everything fell into place and came apart. I kept the letter in my uniform shirt pocket for a while, then taped it to the underside of my bunk frame. When the guards came through for inspections, I'd pretend to clean my floor or fold laundry. Once, they took all my belongings for a surprise search. I watched them rifle through my underwear and toothbrush, my old paperback Bible and socks, and I braced myself for them to find it. But they never looked under the bunk. They didn't find the letter. I took it as a sign that it still wasn't time. After parole, when they issued me civilian clothes and a duffel bag, I folded the letter into my jacket. The paper felt fragile now, like it might crumble if exposed to sunlight. Still, it remained with me, closer than breath. On the bus ride out, I slipped my hand into the pocket and pressed my fingers against the ridges of the folds. I imagined her face, though I had never seen it. I wondered if she resembled her father. I wondered if my words would fall like stones at her feet, or vanish into dust. There was a bench at the transfer station where I sat to rest. I pulled the letter out and reread it silently, moving my lips with the rhythm of the lines. I had written it in plain language, no metaphors, no adjectives designed to soften. It began simply, "My name is Richard Langley. I am the man who took your father's life." There were no excuses after that. I didn't write about my upbringing, or the drugs, or the desperation. I didn't talk about the way my hands shook when it happened, or how I had thrown up afterward. I didn't include the years of prison therapy, the sessions with chaplains, the work assignments in the kitchen, or the solitude. Those things were mine. The only thing I owed her was the truth. The letter described the night in clinical, factual terms. I told her where it happened, how long it took, what I remembered, and most importantly, what I never forgot. I described her father's voice, calm, surprised, almost kind. I told her what I saw in his eyes just before the end. I told her how many times I had replayed that moment, how it echoed across the years like a bell in an empty church. Then I wrote about her, not her name, not her life, just the idea of her. The little girl who had to grow up without a father because of a stranger's choices. I told her I didn't want forgiveness, that I couldn't ask for something I didn't deserve, that I knew silence might be her only answer. I told her she could tear the letter apart, throw it away, burn it, that she didn't owe me anything, but that I had to give her something that had been kept from her for too long. I ended the letter without a signature, just the date and the place where it was written. FCI Terre Haute, Cell 118. The absence of my name felt more honest than its inclusion. She already knew it, or she would when she read the first line. What mattered wasn't who I was. What mattered was what I had done, and that I was finally saying it to the only person who had the right to hear it. When I refolded the letter and placed it back in the plastic bag, I felt the weight of it settle into my coat. I stood slowly, knees cracking like old hinges, and made my way to the connecting bus. The ticket I held was damp from my palm. It would be a short ride now, less than 2 hours to the outskirts of Lexington. I didn't know if I would reach her home before sunset. I didn't know what I would find, but I knew what I would leave behind. The letter in my pocket was not a key, not a gift, not a plea. It was the last honest thing I had left. I didn't carry it to be understood. I carried it because truth, even old and late, deserved to be delivered by hand. I spent the night in a roadside motel about 10 miles outside of Lexington, the kind of place where the curtains never fully close and the carpet smells faintly of mildew and cigarette ash, no matter how many air fresheners they plug into the wall. The room was painted a pale green that had faded into the shade of forgotten things. The bed was lumpy, the mattress groaning under my weight like it hadn't held a person in weeks. I sat on its edge for a long time, my coat still on, the letter still in my pocket. Outside the window, cars passed now and then, headlights flickering through the gap in the curtains like ghosts peeking in. Each time I saw a light sweep the room, I tensed. Even after all these years, my body still reacted to movement the way it had in prison. Always alert, always braced for impact. I told myself that time had passed, that this was a different place, that I was free, but the shadows in my mind didn't leave just because the cell door had opened. I turned on the small television bolted to the dresser. Static greeted me first, then a late-night commercial for an injury lawyer with a too white smile. I turned the volume down until it was barely a hum and let it play in the background while I sat in the dim light of the bedside lamp. I didn't want to sleep. I feared the dreams that would come. They always did. The same ones. The hallway. The blood. The silence after. Sometimes his face. Sometimes hers. I'd grown used to the rituals of insomnia. I would count ceiling stains, trace cracks in the walls, and listen to the hum of the vending machine down the hall. In prison, those noises were comforting in their consistency. Here they felt distant, artificial, like the world had moved on, and I had stayed frozen in place. It was a strange thing to be a relic among the living. I opened the drawer of the nightstand and found a Gideon Bible, its cover cracked with use. I ran my hand across it but didn't open it. I had read it enough times to know what was inside. I wasn't looking for answers anymore. Just stillness. Something to quiet the noise in my head. But nothing did. The letter in my pocket burned like a coal against my leg. I didn't take it out. I didn't need to read it. Its weight was enough to remind me of what tomorrow would bring. When I finally lay back, the pillow was too soft. My neck ached. The ceiling above me was textured with swirls of plaster, like someone had tried to make it look like clouds. It only reminded me of the dust patterns on the walls of my cell. I stared at those clouds for what felt like hours, my eyes never fully closed. Every few minutes, I would hear a sound, a door shutting, footsteps above, the creak of water pipes, and my heart would jump as if someone were coming for me. But there was no one left to come. Sleep did find me, eventually, not gently, but all at once, like a blackout. I woke before dawn, drenched in sweat, the sheets tangled around my legs. My mouth was dry, and my hands ached with the kind of tightness that comes from clenching too long. I sat up slowly, trying to steady my breathing. The dream had already begun to fade, but its residue remained, thick and cold. A hallway, a doorknob, the sound of something falling. I showered with water that never quite turned warm and dressed in the same clothes I had worn the day before. I stared at myself in the mirror, lit by the flickering overhead bulb. My reflection startled me. I had lost so much weight. My face was drawn, cheeks hollowed out, eyes sunken into shadow. A white stubble had returned to my chin, coarse and uneven. I looked like someone who had walked out of a hospital against medical advice. The mirror was cracked in one corner. I traced it with my finger. The line split my face in two, past and present. That seemed fitting. Half a life behind bars, the other half trying to find the courage to leave something honest behind. I packed my few things, mostly unused toiletries, a comb, and a disposable razor still sealed in plastic. None of it mattered. Only the letter. Before I left the room, I sat on the bed again, staring at the carpet. The pattern was made up of brown and beige diamonds, some of them worn down to the threads. I remembered the linoleum of my cell, the way it echoed underfoot when I paced. I had worn a path into that floor over the years, one footfall at a time. Here, there was no echo, just a dead, padded silence. I left the motel key on the dresser and stepped outside into the morning chill. The air smelled like wet asphalt and pine needles. Fog clung to the trees along the highway, softening their edges. I walked to the diner across the parking lot. It was nearly empty, just a trucker reading a newspaper and a waitress wiping down the counter. I sat in a corner booth and ordered a coffee. I barely touched it. The smell reminded me of the prison brew, burnt and bitter, a poor substitute for comfort. I watched the waitress move from table to table. She had the tired posture of someone used to long shifts and short tips. Her hair was tied back in a messy bun, and the soles of her shoes squeaked on the tile. She reminded me of someone, but I couldn't place who. Maybe just the idea of someone I had once known, long before everything fell apart. I paid in cash and left $1 tip on the table. It was all I had to give. I stepped back into the cold and stood for a moment, looking down the road that led into town. The address was tucked into the back of my wallet, but I didn't need to look at it. I had memorized it the way I had memorized the letter. Every digit, every street name etched into me like a scar. I began to walk. Each step felt heavy, like I was dragging the past behind me on a chain. Houses passed in a blur, some old, some new, all indifferent. I kept my eyes down, hands in my coat pockets, trying not to imagine what would happen when I got there. The letter pulsed against my side like a second heartbeat. I had come this far. There was no turning back now. The shadows were no longer behind me. They walked beside me, silent and steady, refusing to be left behind. Finding her had taken longer than I'd expected, though time was something I had too much of and no way to spend. I had begun my search during the final years of my sentence, when the weight of age pressed on me harder than the steel bars. Something had shifted in me after my 75th birthday. I knew I wouldn't last much longer. My bones ached deeper each winter, and the world outside my window seemed more like a memory than a promise. I wasn't trying to escape guilt, and I wasn't after redemption. I simply couldn't stand the thought of leaving this life without telling the truth to the one person it belonged to. I started where the system allowed, the prison library. The resources were thin, outdated, and limited by permissions. But it was a place where quiet was expected, and questions didn't draw attention. I scanned old newspaper articles on a yellowing microfiche machine, leaning close to the screen as words swam in and out of focus. I found an article dated the week of the incident. The headline called it a senseless tragedy. They had printed his name, of course, and a few details about his family. His daughter was only 7 at the time. The article mentioned her name once, Margaret Elaine Willoughby, and that she was taken in by her mother's sister in Kentucky. That single sentence became my map. Back then, it hadn't meant much to me. I remembered being cold in the interrogation room, remembered the stiffness in my hands, the fluorescent lights flickering above me like a warning. I had confessed to everything. I didn't fight the charges. I barely spoke. But I hadn't thought about what happened to the people left behind. The court documents had focused on me, the judge, the lawyers, the reporters. They all spoke of my crime like it existed in isolation. But there had been a child, and that child had grown up in the shadow of something I did. That thought kept me awake most nights in my cell. Once I had her full name, I tried using the prison's computer lab during designated hours. There were restrictions on what we could access, but I learned how to maneuver around them, slowly, patiently. There were public records databases, some free, some outdated, that offered clues. Most of what I found was fragmented. Old high school yearbooks, a marriage announcement, a nursing license registry with partial addresses blacked out for privacy. I pieced together a trail from fragments, like assembling a puzzle where most of the pieces were still missing. I requested access to the interlibrary loan system. It took weeks for approvals to come through, and months for the books and archives to arrive. I studied the geography of Kentucky counties, familiarized myself with zip codes and city directories. I copied down addresses by hand onto a small legal pad, rewriting each one as my handwriting began to tremble more with age. I cross-referenced public voting records with old census entries. Her married name had changed, but I followed the trail of Elaine, her middle name. Few people drop their middle names entirely, even when they marry. Eventually, I narrowed it down to 3 possible addresses, all in Kentucky, all within 50 miles of each other. The first belonged to a woman in her 30s, too young. The second address was a dead end, vacant lot, no structure standing. The third was on a quiet street just outside Lexington. The property records showed a homeowner named Margaret E. Holloway. The name wasn't exact, but it was close. Close enough to turn my stomach. I knew it was her when I found the photograph. A local medical newsletter had published a feature on community nurses during the pandemic. There was a group photo of staff from a hospice center. Second from the left stood a woman with a face that bore the years with dignity. Her eyes were steady, her smile restrained. Her hands were folded over her waist, fingers interlocked, like someone always prepared for bad news. Her name was printed beneath the photo, Margaret Holloway, RN. I stared at that image for hours, the cheap prison computer screen casting a faint blue glow in the library's dim light. I printed it quietly and folded it into my Bible, not out of reverence, just because that was the only place no one would look. I kept researching. I learned the neighborhood she lived in. I memorized the street name, Sycamore Glen. It sounded peaceful, almost too peaceful for what I intended to carry into it. I studied satellite images on a borrowed map and traced the route with my fingertip. There was a bus that went within walking distance. The sidewalk ended a block before the house. The rest would be done on foot. I could already feel the letter in my coat, heavy like a stone I had carried uphill for decades. I never told anyone about the search, not my cellmate, not the chaplain, not the guards who occasionally asked what I did with all my library hours. Some thought I was reading religious texts. Others assumed I was preparing for release. They weren't wrong. I was preparing for something I could barely name. Not freedom, not closure, just an arrival. When my parole was finalized and the release date set, I had everything I needed. The address was scribbled onto a small note card tucked between the pages of an outdated bus schedule. I had memorized the zip code. The house was brick, single-story, with a narrow driveway and a small porch. The county assessor's record said it was built in the 70s, after the crime, after the trial, after her childhood was already gone. I imagined her standing in that doorway, older now, a stranger to me, but not to what I'd done. The closer I came to release, the more I rehearsed the moment of arrival. Would I knock? Would I speak? Would I leave the letter and walk away without being seen? I didn't know. I only knew I had to get there. The search had become a kind of ritual, each step binding me more tightly to the task. There was no longer a choice. I had passed a threshold long ago. Somewhere between the court date and the first night, I heard my name echo down a prison hallway. What started as a vague intention had hardened into something more permanent. Not a mission, not repentance, just a man walking toward the only truth he had left to give. And now I had the address. I had found her. The rest was only silence and miles. I arrived in Lexington on a Thursday, just after noon. The air was heavy with the scent of damp leaves and cut grass, the remnants of an early morning rain still lingering in the gutters and along the curbs. I stepped off the bus with a stiffness in my knees that hadn't eased since I first boarded. My coat was too warm for the weather, but I kept it on. The letter was inside, pressed to my chest in its plastic sheath, and I didn't trust it anywhere else. Not in the duffel bag slung over my shoulder. Not in my hand. I needed to feel it near my heart, like an anchor holding me upright. The terminal was small. A few plastic chairs bolted to the floor, a vending machine humming in the corner, and a rack of faded brochures advertising local attractions. I sat near the window and watched the traffic pass on the street outside. Across from me, a young couple argued in hushed tones. The man was holding a baby. The woman kept checking her phone. I tried not to listen. I had trained myself for years to block out the noise of others. Still, the sound of the infant's soft whimpering brought something sharp to the surface of my thoughts, something old and unfinished. I looked away. I didn't have a plan for that day. I hadn't bought a return ticket. I didn't know if I would even need one. All I had was the address written on a worn note card and the memory of the street layout I'd studied 100 times. I didn't go there right away. I couldn't. My legs were tired, but my hesitation ran deeper than muscle. I told myself I needed to rest, to gather my thoughts, but the truth was simpler. I was afraid. I left the terminal and walked until I found a small diner tucked between a laundromat and a pharmacy. Its awning was striped red and white, sun-bleached and fraying at the edges. Inside, the smell of fried food clung to the air like smoke. I chose a booth near the back, facing the wall, and ordered a cup of black coffee. It tasted like burnt oil and regret, but it was hot, and it gave my hands something to do. I sat there for hours, nursing that single cup, watching the minute hand of the clock above the counter crawl through time. I thought about the door I hadn't yet approached, about the face I hadn't seen in 5 decades, not since the courtroom. She had been a child then, clutching her aunt's coat sleeve, her eyes wide and dry and distant. I had seen her for less than a minute as I was led away in cuffs. She didn't cry, at least not in front of me. That image had stayed with me, etched into the space behind my eyes like a photograph that never fades. I imagined what her life had become, whether she had children, whether she laughed often or rarely, whether she ever thought about the man who stole her father away. I didn't expect her to remember my name. I didn't want her to. But I knew the letter would bring the past roaring back. I would be the shadow stepping through the cracks of her foundation, uninvited and unwanted. Still, I believed she had the right to hear the truth from the source, not from old articles or forgotten court records. I watched the waitress clean the counter with slow, practiced motions. Her apron was stained with grease and ketchup, and she wore sneakers with worn soles. She looked at me once or twice, probably wondering if I was waiting for someone or just loitering. I left her a few dollars for the coffee and walked back outside, the bell above the door jangling behind me like an alarm. It was late afternoon by then. The light had shifted, stretching shadows across the sidewalk. I wandered through a nearby park. The benches were wet with dew and sap, so I leaned against a tree and watched the leaves flutter in the breeze. Children played in the distance, their shouts piercing the quiet with the innocence of those untouched by consequence. I tried to remember what it felt like to run without fear. My legs had long forgotten. I sat on a dry bench once the sun warmed the wood and pulled the letter out from my coat. I didn't unfold it. I just held it there in my lap, like a weight I could no longer deny. A dog trotted by with its leash trailing behind. Its owner jogged after it, breathless but laughing. I envied them. Not their health, not their freedom, but their unawareness of what it meant to carry a truth too old to explain. I checked the note card again, tracing the street name with my thumb. Sycamore Glen, the house number, the zip code. I recited it silently, like a litany. I could have walked there then. It wasn't far, maybe 30 minutes, but I didn't move. I stayed on that bench until the sky began to darken and the streetlights blinked to life one by one. When night fell, I returned to the bus terminal. It was quieter now, emptier. I sat in the same seat by the window and watched my own reflection in the glass. The man who stared back at me looked tired, unsure, and older than I remembered. His shoulders sagged. His eyes held the weight of too many yesterdays. I looked away. I thought I might sleep there, but I knew I wouldn't. Not really. The chairs were hard, and the fluorescent lighting hummed overhead without mercy. I walked instead, circling the block, passing the same storefronts again and again until my feet hurt, and the cold slipped through the seams of my coat. I found a 24-hour cafe and ordered tea. The cup steamed in my hands, but I didn't drink it. I watched the door, expecting nothing. The hours crept by. Morning would come soon, and with it, the walk, the final one, the last few turns that would bring me to her doorstep. But that night, I just waited. I waited for courage. I waited for stillness. I waited for time to give me something it never had: permission. I left just after sunrise. The sky was a muted gray, clouded over with the kind of dullness that made everything look softer, less defined. I preferred it that way. Too much sunlight made things too clear, too honest, too exposed. I walked past the cafe where I had sat through most of the night, past the empty bus stop, past a row of houses with newspaper bundles on their steps, and sprinklers already ticking in slow arcs across dew-covered lawns. The neighborhood was just beginning to stir, and I moved through it like a shadow that didn't belong. The letter remained in the inside pocket of my coat, close to my chest, folded and sealed in its plastic sleeve. I didn't touch it. I didn't need to. Its presence was constant, its weight familiar now, like a scar you stop noticing until something brushes too close. I had memorized every crack in its fold, every smudge in the ink. I knew where it creased, where the pressure from my fingers had softened the edges over years of holding it. It was no longer a letter. It was a part of me. The streets were quiet. A few early joggers passed by, nodding politely, earbuds tucked into their ears, their focus inward. I didn't return their nods. I kept my gaze low, not out of shame, but because I had spent too many years learning how to make myself invisible. That habit didn't vanish just because the gates had opened behind me. I crossed a small bridge that arched over a creek. The water below moved slowly, littered with fallen leaves and the occasional piece of wind-blown trash. A heron stood motionless on the bank, its thin legs like reeds, its head cocked toward the water, as if listening to something I couldn't hear. I paused on the bridge, not for the view, but because my legs ached and my breath came heavier than I expected. I leaned against the railing and let the cold iron seep into my palms. The morning was quiet, but the silence inside me was louder. I had spent years imagining this walk. In my mind, it had always been longer, more dramatic. Storms above, footsteps echoing, perhaps even a trembling hand. But reality was gentler, slower, and somehow crueler in that softness. The world wasn't holding its breath for me. It was just turning, indifferently, like it always had. My journey didn't mean anything to the trees, or to the squirrels darting across the lawns, or to the mail truck idling on the corner. That made it feel both more painful and more necessary. If the world wasn't watching, then I had to be even more deliberate. I had to carry the moment myself. I walked along the sidewalk until the city began to thin. The houses became more spaced out, the trees taller, older. I passed a small church with a white steeple and a rusted bell that looked like it hadn't rung in years. A hand-painted sign in front read, "Forgiveness is not forgetting. It is remembering without pain." I didn't stop walking. I didn't want to read it again. Words like that never sat right with me. Not after what I'd done. They sounded like they were written for other people. My feet started to blister inside my shoes, but I didn't slow down. I had taken worse steps on harder ground. Prison floors had taught me how to walk without looking like I was hurting. I kept my pace steady, letting the pain rise and fall like a tide. Every step forward was one less left to take. As I got closer, I recognized the landmarks I had studied on the maps: a grocery store with faded signage, a gas station with only 2 pumps, a row of mailboxes set into a wooden frame, numbers stenciled in black paint. I counted them as I passed. I knew hers was the 8th from the left. I didn't touch it, just noted it in my mind like a quiet confirmation. The final stretch was Sycamore Glen. It curved gently, lined with maple trees that had just begun to turn at the edges. Yellows and reds crept through the green like veins. The houses here were modest but well kept: clean siding, trimmed hedges, porches with wind chimes and seasonal wreaths. I walked slower now. My breath caught in my throat, not from the distance, but from the nearness. It was all real, not a photograph, not a satellite image, not a detail scribbled in a notebook under dim library lights. It was real. Her house stood near the bend, brick with white shutters and a single step leading to the porch. A planter box hung beneath the front window, filled with mums that sagged slightly under their own weight. The door was painted blue. A doormat read, "Welcome." The irony of it settled somewhere behind my ribs like a dull ache. I stopped across the street. My legs didn't want to move. My mouth went dry. I stood there, pretending to admire the trees, pretending to be anyone else: a passerby, a lost traveler, a tired old man with no destination. I stayed like that for a long time, watching, listening, waiting. I looked for signs of life, curtains shifting, a figure in the window. But the house was still. There was a small ceramic frog on the porch rail, its mouth open in a permanent smile. Beside it, a pair of shoes sat neatly tucked under the bench. Women's sneakers, worn, but clean. She was home. Or at least someone was. The road felt longer than it should have as I crossed it. My feet dragged. My hand kept reaching for the letter in my coat, as if touching it could steady me. The sidewalk was cracked near her mailbox. I stepped over the crack and stood at the bottom of her porch steps. 1, 2. Then the door. I didn't knock. Not yet. Instead, I sat down on the bench beside the ceramic frog. I didn't care if someone saw. I didn't care if I looked strange. I needed the moment. I needed to feel the earth beneath me, to remind myself that I had arrived. I had walked all this way, not just from downtown, not just from the motel, but from a place that no longer existed, a place called before. I looked at the blue door. I looked at my hands. They were shaking slightly, like they always did when I was afraid. But I wasn't turning back. I was here, and soon she would know why. I stood at the threshold, longer than I ever thought a man could stand, without crumbling. The blue of her front door was faded in places, especially around the handle, where countless turns of a key had worn the paint down to bare wood. It was the kind of wear that only came with time, an intimate erosion, slow and invisible until it was part of the house's character. That door had been opened and closed for decades, to neighbors, to friends, maybe to family. But it had never been opened for someone like me. The porch boards creaked gently beneath my feet as I shifted my weight. The sound wasn't loud, but it echoed in my bones like a gavel in a courtroom. My shadow fell across the mat, stretching just shy of the doorframe. It felt like a line I couldn't yet cross, a space between one life and another, a quiet that had to be filled with something more than fear. I reached into my coat and touched the letter, not to pull it out, but to remind myself it was still there, still real, still ready. The sky had turned pale with morning light, and birds were beginning their routines. Somewhere behind the house, a dog barked once, and then went silent. A lawnmower coughed into life a few houses down, breaking the quiet with its rhythmic growl. Life was happening all around me, normal and uninterested, and yet I stood suspended in a kind of invisible stillness. The world didn't know that a man was about to lift his hand and knock on the door of his past. My breathing had gone shallow, my chest tight. I looked down at my shoes, scuffed at the toes, the laces frayed. They had been a donation from the halfway center I stayed in after release. Functional, but not made for long walks. The left heel had started to split, and I could feel the seam biting into my sock. It was a small discomfort, but it tethered me to the moment. I wasn't floating. I wasn't dreaming. I was there, on her porch, alive. I turned my head slightly and studied the window to the left of the door. The curtains were drawn, but behind the sheer layer I thought I saw a flicker of movement, a shape passing by, or perhaps the sway of the fabric in the breeze from an open vent. I couldn't be sure. I didn't want to be sure. The anticipation was its own weight, pressing on my shoulders like the last few pages of a long-forgotten book finally being turned. The envelope in my pocket felt warmer than the rest of my body. I had carried it through cities, through rain, through sleepless nights, and long silences. But I hadn't carried it for her benefit. I had carried it because it was the only thing I had left to deliver. It had become something more than paper and ink. It was proof that I had not buried the truth, even when I had buried everything else. The blue paint on the door shimmered faintly in the morning light. It reminded me of something nautical, like the hull of an old boat, the kind that had been scrubbed and repaired and painted over 100 times, but always bore the signs of every voyage. I wondered how many storms she had weathered behind that door, how many nights she had sat alone and remembered a father she never really got to know. I wondered if she kept a photograph of him somewhere near, a small frame on a shelf, a face she might have grown up comparing to her own. I reached out and let my knuckles hover above the wood. My hand trembled slightly, not from age alone, but from the enormity of what this moment carried. I had no illusions about what might happen. I wasn't hoping for forgiveness. I didn't believe in cinematic endings or sudden grace. I didn't think a single knock would dissolve the weight of 5 decades. I just believed in the necessity of showing up, in the act of standing there, of being seen, of being heard, even if it was only through a closed door. I hesitated again. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the branches of a nearby tree, and a few dry leaves skittered across the porch. One brushed against my shoe and then continued off the edge, lost to the sidewalk. I thought about turning away, about leaving the letter on the doormat and walking back the way I came. But something rooted me there, something deeper than obligation, a gravity that couldn't be ignored. I looked at the doorknob. It was brass, dulled by weather and the touch of time. I imagined her hand on it. I imagined the way it might turn if she decided to open the door, to see who was standing there. I pictured the brief moment of confusion, the narrowing of her eyes, the shock of recognition that might not even come. After all, I wasn't the man from the courtroom anymore. I wasn't the man from the papers. I wasn't even the man I used to be. I was only the result of those years. I was aftermath. I finally let my hand fall and tapped gently on the wood. Once. Twice. The sound was soft, barely more than the rustle of wind. It was not a demand. It was a whisper, a question without expectation. I stepped back, not wanting to appear threatening, and folded my hands in front of me to keep them from shaking. I waited. A minute passed, then 2. The house remained still. No footsteps, no shadows, no reply. But I didn't move. I stood on that porch as the sun climbed higher and the day grew louder. I stood there because I had nowhere else to go, and because some truths deserve to be delivered in person, even if they go unanswered. Even if the door never opens. I stood there with my back to the door, staring down the quiet street, hands clasped in front of me like a mourner at a grave. Every instinct inside me urged retreat. The longer I waited, the heavier the silence became, as if the very air around the porch grew thicker with each passing second. The knock had been soft, gentle, a whisper rather than a summons. I had meant it that way. But now I wondered if she had even heard it, or worse, had she heard and chosen not to answer? The thought sat in my chest like a stone. A part of me wanted to lift my hand again and knock louder, just once, just to be sure. But something deeper held me back. I wasn't there to insist. I wasn't there to demand her attention or force her to reckon with my presence. I was there to tell the truth, yes, but on her terms, not mine. And if her terms meant silence, then I had to honor that. But waiting in the stillness, with my own breathing the only sound I could rely on, became its own kind of punishment. I shifted my weight from one foot to the other. My knees ached. My shoulders were stiff. My body was reminding me that I wasn't young anymore. The time had carved valleys in my joints and shortened the space between thought and exhaustion. I thought of sitting down again, but I remained upright, as if standing was the only act of dignity left to me. I hadn't dressed to impress, but I had chosen my best shirt that morning, the one without the fraying collar. I had shaved carefully, my hand trembling with the razor, nicking my chin twice. It didn't matter. I needed to be clean. I needed to look like a man who took this moment seriously. Behind me, the door remained still. Not even a creak of floorboards, no shuffle of feet. I imagined her standing there, just on the other side, perhaps peering through the peephole or behind the curtain. I imagined her debating whether to open the door at all. Maybe she recognized me. Maybe she didn't. Maybe the name had haunted her, or maybe it had been buried beneath 1,000 other facts of adulthood. Time changes memory. I knew that well. Still, I hoped she felt something. Curiosity, confusion, recognition, anything but indifference. But the silence persisted. The letter pressed against my chest like a second heart. Its rhythm was irregular, erratic, or maybe that was just my own. I reached into my coat, pulled it out slowly, and held it in both hands. It looked so small, so unassuming. Just a single envelope, slightly yellowed, the edges softened by age. The ink of her name was faint, written in careful cursive, the kind I had practiced over and over so it wouldn't look rushed or desperate. I stared at it for a long time, as if waiting for it to tell me what to do next. Doubt crept in, sharp and uninvited. What if I was wrong? What if she wasn't home? What if this wasn't even her house? I had been so sure. I had studied the public records, the directories, the photograph from the hospice newsletter. I had walked the street in my mind 100 times before I ever stepped foot on it. And yet now, standing here, I felt a crack forming in the foundation of that certainty. I looked at the mailbox, the house number, the garden tools neatly arranged by the steps. All of it matched what I had found. But still, a voice inside whispered, maybe she moved, maybe she remarried, maybe she changed everything about her life to erase the shadow I left behind. That thought, of being erased, hurt more than I expected. I didn't deserve a place in her life. I knew that. But to be reduced to nothing, to be scrubbed out so cleanly that even my name meant nothing to her anymore, felt like a second death. I had carried the burden of that one night every day for 50 years, and I had carried her, too. A girl I had never met, a child I had only seen from across a courtroom, had become the silent witness to every act of reflection I had ever attempted. I had thought of her when I lay awake at night. I had thought of her when I wrote the letter. I had thought of her every time I stood in front of a mirror and wondered what kind of man I had become. And now, she might not even know who I was. My hands began to tremble, and I lowered the letter before it betrayed me. I tucked it back into my coat, close to my chest where the world couldn't see it shake. I stepped away from the door and walked to the edge of the porch. The street was still empty. A single bird called from a rooftop nearby, its cry sharp and solitary. I let the sound pass through me and disappear. I closed my eyes. This wasn't how I had imagined it. In my mind, there had always been clarity. Either she opened the door or she didn't. Either she spoke or she sent me away. But this uncertainty, the waiting, the silence, the unbearable possibility that I would leave without knowing whether she had even seen me, it was worse than rejection. It was purgatory. I thought about calling out her name. Just once. A soft Margaret carried on the wind. But I couldn't. My voice felt lodged deep in my chest, as if speaking it aloud would break something fragile inside me. I had no right to speak her name like that. Not without permission. Not anymore. So I stood there, frozen in place, between going and staying, between action and stillness. I thought of every step that had led me here. The search, the sleepless nights, the walk through quiet streets. All of it funneled into this moment, this simple threshold that now felt like a wall. And yet I couldn't knock again. Not because I was afraid of her answer, but because I knew that silence might be the only answer she could give. And I had to accept that. I had to make peace with the idea that telling the truth doesn't guarantee it will be received, that knocking doesn't mean the door will open. The battle wasn't with her. It was inside me. The fight to speak when the words might never be heard. The fight to stand still when my legs begged to run. The fight to deliver something that might be tossed aside the moment I left. The fight to stay human despite knowing that I might always be defined by what I did, not what I had become. I didn't know how long I stood there. Minutes, hours, a lifetime. Eventually, I stepped back toward the door again, but not to knock, not this time. I stepped forward again, but this time with a different weight in my chest. The hesitation was still there. It never truly left, but it had quieted beneath something firmer, something that came not from hope or resolve, but from finality. This wasn't about courage. I had no illusions of being brave. It wasn't about absolution either. I knew forgiveness, if it ever came, wouldn't wear my name. What I felt was a kind of surrender, not to weakness, but to the truth I had carried far too long. I had come to this door not to be seen, not even to be heard, but to make sure that what needed to be said was placed, deliberately, honestly, into the air between us, even if that air remained untouched. My knuckles hovered inches from the wood again. The paint looked more chipped than it had earlier, or maybe the light had shifted. The grain of the door rippled beneath the surface, small scars in the timber that reminded me of tree bark, aged and deeply lived in. I thought of all the hands that had knocked on this door before mine. Mail carriers, neighbors, Girl Scouts, friends, the kind of people welcome in a life that knew laughter and habit. I didn't belong among them. I knew that. But here I was anyway, not as a guest, but as a shadow returning to the surface. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, and with that release, my hand made contact. One knock. I paused, then another. Not loud, not timid, just enough. The sound of it echoed through the wood and back into my bones. It felt sharper than I had expected. A noise that sliced clean through the hush that had wrapped itself around the house. I stepped back again, hands at my sides, as if waiting for something sacred to begin. The world held its breath with me. No bird song, no passing car, no rustle of leaves. Only the lingering vibration of my knock in the air. I imagined her inside. I saw her in my mind, rising from a chair in the living room, setting aside a book or a mug, wondering who could possibly be at the door this early. Maybe she lived alone. Maybe she moved slowly now, her joints stiff from time, her hearing not what it once was. Maybe she didn't hear the knock at all, or maybe she did, and she was already close, watching, waiting, choosing. My heart pounded with a slow, deliberate rhythm. It wasn't panic. It was rhythm, a steady drumbeat of something ancient in me coming to the surface. The kind of feeling I hadn't had since the day of my sentencing. That sense of standing before something irreversible, the knowledge that whatever followed would carry weight. I looked down at my shoes again, dust-covered now, the left toe scuffed white from the edge of the porch step. A small beetle crept across the floorboard near my feet, antennae flicking in slow arcs. I watched it with the strange stillness that comes when the world reduces itself to quiet details. I had lived so long inside silence, and yet now that I had stepped into the open with a simple knock, the silence felt different. It wasn't empty. It was waiting. The door remained closed. No creak, no movement. Not yet. I scanned the edges of the porch. An old broom leaned against the side of the house, a small wind chime hanging near the corner, its shells unmoving in the still morning air. The quiet had a weight, and it pressed against my shoulders as if to remind me that this moment was not mine to control. I began to speak, not out loud, not with sound, but in the place behind my teeth, where words sometimes lived too long. I rehearsed the first sentence of what I would say if the door opened. I had practiced it for years, but now it felt distant, foreign. Nothing rehearsed could survive the presence of what I felt now. If she opened the door, I would not be a man with a speech. I would be a man with a letter, a man whose words had failed him too many times before. I thought about turning away. I thought about placing the letter on the doormat and walking down the steps, letting it speak where I could not. But still, I waited. The sky had brightened slightly, though the clouds were still low, unmoving. The light was soft on the brick of the house, casting no sharp shadows, only a gray softness that blurred the lines between shapes. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and old wood, and something floral, perhaps from the planter box near the window. The scent triggered something in me, not memory exactly, but the shape of one. Something from childhood, something I could never hold on to long enough to name. The longer I stood there, the more I realized this moment wasn't about her. It was about me facing something I had buried so deeply that even years of prison hadn't unearthed it. It was about knocking, not expecting, about arriving, not being welcomed, about truth, spoken or not. And yet, as time passed, doubt began to creep again, this time not about her, but about myself. Had I waited too long? Was this too late? Did silence mean rejection, or did it mean grief too deep to answer? I would never know unless she opened that door, but still she didn't. I looked down at the letter once more, still in my coat. I slid it out slowly, held it in both hands. The paper was soft now, worn from the journey. My thumbs brushed the edges, smoothing invisible creases. I studied her name, written in my neatest hand. A name I had never spoken aloud, but one I had carried with me longer than any other. I looked at the doormat, clean, beige, with a simple border. No words, just a blank square where shoes rested and visitors paused. I could leave it there. It would take only a moment, a quiet offering. But I hadn't come all this way to vanish without one last breath of presence. So I stepped forward once more, and knocked again. After the second knock, the silence grew louder. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the kind of silence that expands, fills every crevice of thought, and leaves no room for distraction. It crept into my ears and down my spine, pressing against my ribs like a presence in itself. I remained still, eyes fixed on the blue door, waiting for any sign of life. A creak in the floorboards, the soft drag of slippers on wood, the subtle hiss of a curtain being pulled aside. anything that might have told me I wasn't just speaking to bricks and paint. But there was nothing. No acknowledgement, no refusal, no acceptance, just stillness. My breath slowed, but not out of calm. It was the kind of slowness that comes when you brace yourself for a blow, when you know that what you came to deliver may fall, unheard, into the void. I shifted slightly on the porch, my shoes grinding against the wood, a small sound in an otherwise breathless world. The wind didn't move, the trees didn't sway. Even the birds which had chirped faintly earlier now seemed to hold their voices in reserve, as though they too were waiting for something to happen. I looked down at the doorknob. It remained still, unmoved, blank in its silence. I stared at it the way a man might stare at a locked gate in a dream, willing it to turn, to admit him, to confirm he had truly reached the end of his long journey. But it was indifferent, just a metal object worn by years of repetition, unaware of the weight placed upon it now. I turned slightly, letting my eyes wander across the details of the porch, anything to anchor myself in the physical world. The flower box below the front window overflowed with yellow and white mums, petals just beginning to curl with the changing season. One bloom had browned completely, tucked beneath the others, unnoticed, but not untouched by time. The trim around the doorframe bore small scratches, likely from a dog's claws, or perhaps the careless edge of a grocery bag. A spider had spun a thin, delicate web in the upper corner near the light fixture, catching the morning light like threads of glass. Everything looked lived in, touched, real. And yet I felt like an intruder in a photograph, someone stepping into a frame where he did not belong. I tried to listen again, this time with more than just my ears. I strained to feel the air inside the house. Was there movement? A breath? A shifting weight on a floorboard? I imagined her standing just on the other side of the door, frozen like me, unsure whether to move, to act, to receive. Maybe her hand hovered near the handle, uncertain. Maybe she knew exactly who I was, or maybe I was just another knock in a long day, one that could be ignored, filed away, forgotten. I reached into my coat and pulled the letter out once more. The act felt familiar now, like an involuntary motion, a reflex. I turned it over in my hands, checked the corners, the writing, the seal. I had looked at this letter so many times that it no longer felt like a message. It felt like an artifact, something dug up from the ruins of a life that had already ended. The paper had yellowed slightly from my fingers, and the name written across the front had softened under the pressure of time and handling. I thought about sliding it under the door. I even knelt for a moment, just to see if the gap would allow it. It would, barely. But I didn't do it. Something held me back, not doubt, not fear, but the sense that placing the letter like that would be the end. A final gesture. And I wasn't ready for that. Not because I needed her to open the door, but because I wasn't sure if I had fully said goodbye to the version of myself that had carried it this far. So I stood again and waited, and the door remained closed. I began to take note of the way the light changed on the porch, how the shadows shifted as the sun crept higher in the sky. A sliver of warmth touched my shoulder where the overhang ended, and I leaned slightly into it. I hadn't felt natural sunlight like this in so long, without the interruption of barbed wire or chain-link fencing. It felt real in a way nothing else had all morning. Still, I could not leave. Not yet. This moment, this waiting, it was more than just anticipation. It was reckoning. It was standing still after decades of motion. Every breath I took, every beat of my heart, pulsed against the silence behind that door. It wasn't rejection that hurt. It was absence. The absence of reaction. The absence of closure. The absence of even the smallest confirmation that what I carried mattered. I tried to remember his face. Her father. It had blurred over time, not from guilt, but from the erosion of memory. What remained was not his features, but the shape of his presence, the sound of his voice, the slope of his shoulders, the way he turned toward me in surprise that final night. I had stolen something from him, something from her, and no letter could return it. But I had tried. This, standing here, letter in hand, heartbeat slowing with age, was the attempt. The only one I had left. A car passed slowly at the end of the street, tires crackling over fallen leaves. I didn't turn to look. I was afraid that movement would mean the moment had passed, that the door would never open, that the silence was not just temporary, but permanent. I stayed still, like stone, like the statue of a man who had nothing left but the truth he carried and the hope that someone would accept it. Eventually, I lowered the letter again and placed it gently against my chest, resting my palm over it as though to quiet it. I closed my eyes. I had come this far. And still, the silence behind the door held. The decision came not like a flash, but like a tide, slow, rising, inevitable. I had stood on that porch long enough to feel the passage of time in my bones, in the shifting light on the brick, in the weight of the letter growing heavier in my hands. My body, aged and worn, had grown stiff from the waiting, but it was the stillness inside the house that finally spoke the loudest. No voice, no reply, no gesture of acknowledgement, just the kind of silence that one learns to recognize after a lifetime of listening to locked doors. I looked down at the envelope again. It was no longer just paper. It was a symbol, a relic, a small vessel of truth I had carried farther than most men carry their regrets. It had outlasted decades of pride, shame, and indecision. It had survived the hours in prison yards, the nights of retraced memories, the years of imagining what it might mean if it ever reached her hands. I had folded and unfolded it so many times that the creases were as familiar to me as the lines in my palm. I took one last look at the door. I memorized its every detail, the chipped paint near the hinges, the way the sunlight cast a faint glow across the handle, the tiny dent just beneath the peephole, possibly from a suitcase or the corner of a box. This was her space, her world, and I was only a visitor at the edge of it, permitted nothing more than a moment outside. I bent down slowly, knees resisting, joints protesting with the usual creaks and aches that had become part of my daily rhythm. I knelt on one leg and placed the letter carefully on the welcome mat. I didn't slide it under the door. I didn't wedge it into the screen. I simply set it there, visible, unhidden, bare. The act was gentle, deliberate. I pressed the edges flat so the wind wouldn't lift it. It felt like a kind of ceremony, one I had practiced in my mind 100 different ways, but never like this. I had imagined placing it into her hands, seeing the moment her fingers touched the paper, watching her eyes scan the name, perhaps recognizing the handwriting, perhaps not. But I hadn't accounted for silence. I hadn't planned for the door that stayed shut. And yet, the letter found its place anyway. I remained there a moment longer, crouched like a man in prayer, though I had long since stopped speaking to anything that might listen. The porch boards beneath me were cool and smooth. The morning air had grown warmer, but it did little to ease the chill in my chest. I stared at the envelope and wondered what she would think when she found it. Would she hesitate to touch it? Would she toss it away unopened, its contents too heavy to risk? Would she read it in secret, behind a locked door, away from the eyes of whoever now shared her world? I would never know. And that was the truth I had to accept. Truth without witness, confession without response, offering without return. I placed one hand on the step to steady myself and slowly rose back to my feet. My body moved with reluctance, not from pain alone, but from the knowledge that this, here, now, was the end of something long and quiet and deeply lived. I brushed off my pants and straightened the lapels of my coat. I stood tall, not out of pride, but because that letter deserved to be delivered by a man still standing. I took one last look at the door. I imagined her voice. I imagined the creak of the hinges. I imagined what could have been said if time had been kinder to us both. Then I turned. The street before me remained still, bathed in the pale glow of mid-morning. A few cars moved in the distance. A man walked his dog on the opposite sidewalk, unaware of the moment unfolding behind him. Life, as it always does, continued without pause. I stepped off the porch, slowly, letting each footfall settle into the earth with purpose. The wind stirred faintly now, catching the edge of my coat and brushing against my face, like a reminder of the world I was returning to. Not a freer world, not a better one, just a different one. One that had no place for a man like me, except for this: a single morning, a single doorstep, a single truth left behind. I didn't look back, not because I didn't want to, but because I had already said what I needed to say. I had placed the letter, and now it no longer belonged to me. I walked away from the house without any sense of ceremony. There was no dramatic pause at the edge of the driveway, no slow turn to take one final look at the door. The weight I had carried for so many years hadn't disappeared, but it had changed. It had loosened its grip just enough for me to breathe again. Not fully, not freely, but enough. The letter, now resting on her doormat, had transferred something from my hands to hers, if she chose to accept it, or even see it. The sidewalk felt uneven beneath my shoes, though I knew the concrete had likely been poured in neat, straight lines. My feet dragged slightly, not from fatigue alone, but from the strange disorientation that comes after an ending you can't quite name. I kept my eyes forward. I didn't glance back. The house faded behind me in stages: the porch, the door, the windows, the trees. And then it was just another shape in a neighborhood of quiet homes, no longer singular, no longer charged with the unbearable electricity of expectation. The street was the same as it had been when I arrived, but everything in me had changed. I wasn't lighter, I wasn't healed, but I was empty in a new way, as though something long dead inside me had been allowed, at last, to be buried. The silence behind her door had hurt more than I'd expected, but it hadn't crushed me. It hadn't undone the walk, or the knock, or the letter. I had done what I came to do. That was all there was left. I followed the same path back through the neighborhood, the same mailboxes, the same fences, the same wind chimes that hadn't moved. I passed a child's bicycle left on a lawn, its training wheels caked with dried mud. I passed a man unloading groceries from the trunk of his car, each plastic bag sagging with routine. No one looked at me twice. To them, I was just another old man walking home from nowhere. I found a bench at the edge of a small park and sat down. My knees cracked when I lowered myself, the kind of noise that reminded me of time more than any calendar ever had. I rested my hands on my thighs and stared out at a patch of grass littered with fallen leaves. The colors were fading now. No more brilliant reds, just brittle browns and soft yellows curling in on themselves. The breeze was gentle but persistent. A few leaves stirred and rolled along the ground, scraping softly against the concrete. I sat there for a long while. There was no destination left, no plan. I had never imagined anything beyond that doorstep. My life had narrowed so entirely around the delivery of that letter that now, in the aftermath, everything felt shapeless. I had never expected a warm welcome. I hadn't even expected acknowledgement. But I had allowed myself to picture a response, any response. A face behind the window, a curtain moving, a breath caught in surprise. Instead, I had left behind only paper and silence. I reached into my coat out of habit, forgetting that the letter was gone. My fingers touched the lining of the pocket, and I closed them slowly, as if trying to grasp something that was no longer there. It was a strange absence. I had lived with that letter so long that its removal felt like losing a limb. I didn't feel regret, only disorientation. After a while, I stood again. My legs were stiff. I pressed one hand against the bench for support, then made my way toward the nearest bus stop. I didn't check the schedule. I didn't even know where I was going. Just away. Away from the house. Away from the letter. Away from the version of myself that had existed in that moment on the porch. I boarded the bus without a word. The driver didn't look at me. I found a seat in the back and sat by the window. As the bus pulled away, I watched the city recede, piece by piece. Stores, stoplights, strangers. The sky remained gray, but the clouds were higher now, as if the weather had finally taken a breath after holding it in all morning. I leaned my forehead against the glass. It was cold, grounding. My reflection looked older than I remembered. The lines on my face were deeper, the shadows beneath my eyes darker. I didn't flinch at the sight. I didn't look away. This was the face of a man who had finally spoken without words. Somewhere along the ride, I closed my eyes. I didn't sleep, but I drifted into a space where sound dimmed and memory softened. I didn't think about prison. I didn't think about the courtroom. I didn't think about what I had taken. I thought only of the porch, of the moment the letter left my hand, of the wind as it passed over my shoulders, cool and indifferent. When the bus reached the edge of town, I got off. I walked to a small diner across the street and ordered a cup of coffee. The waitress poured it without asking questions. I sat by the window and wrapped my hands around the mug, not drinking, just feeling the warmth through the ceramic. Outside, cars passed in both directions. People moved with purpose, as they always did. I thought about her again, Margaret. I wondered if she had found the letter yet, if she had stepped outside for the paper, if she had seen the envelope lying there like something out of place, a small white rectangle disrupting the routine of her morning. I wondered if she had recognized the handwriting, if her hands had trembled when she picked it up, or maybe she hadn't noticed it at all. Maybe the wind had carried it off before she ever opened the door. I would never know. That was the part I hadn't prepared for, the final unknowable. But I accepted it, because the act had been mine alone to carry, and I had carried it as far as I could. I spent the night in a budget motel just outside the city limits, the kind of place with cigarette burns on the windowsill and a television that only got 3 working channels. I didn't care about the comfort. I wasn't looking for rest. I was simply waiting for the world to shift, just slightly, under the weight of what I had done. But it didn't. Nothing changed. I sat on the edge of the bed, shoes still on, hands resting on my knees, and listened to the hollow tick of the wall clock above the mini-fridge. The silence was familiar, not unwelcome, but different now. Emptier, somehow, like something had been scraped out of me and left behind. I didn't feel proud. There was no relief. I hadn't imagined redemption, and none came. I didn't feel forgiven, because I hadn't asked for that. What I felt was something simpler and harder to name. A kind of stillness that came from having done the thing I'd promised myself I would do. A private promise kept. A quiet task fulfilled. The kind of honesty that wasn't owed to the world, but to yourself, when no one else is left to witness it. I lay down, fully clothed, arms crossed over my chest, eyes open until morning. I didn't sleep. I listened to the occasional rumble of a car passing outside, to the hum of the refrigerator, to the rain tapping on the window pane around 3 in the morning. The sound was soft, rhythmic, like the breathing of something ancient and indifferent. I watched the shadow of the curtains sway as the air from the wall unit stirred them. My body ached in a way that had nothing to do with age. Not soreness, not pain, just the echo of something that had ended, though no one had marked its passing. When the sky began to lighten, I sat up and reached for my coat. My hands moved slowly, automatically. I checked the inside pocket, even though I knew it was empty. The letter was gone. There was no reason to check, but still, my fingers searched the fold of the fabric like they had every morning for years. It was instinct. Grief, I suppose, for something I had carried for so long that its absence now felt like a wound. I stood and walked to the mirror over the sink. The man staring back at me looked no different than he had the day before. The lines around his eyes had not softened. The mouth still curved downward at the corners, an old habit of withholding expression. But the eyes, there was something in them. Not peace, not sorrow, just the faintest suggestion of completion, of a task finally laid down. I left the motel before 7. I didn't leave a tip. I didn't say goodbye to the desk clerk. I walked to the corner diner where I had sat the day before, ordered oatmeal and black coffee, and stared out the window. The trees across the street had turned more golden overnight, the kind of early fall color that reminded me of childhood walks home from school, of leaves crunching underfoot, of the smell of burning wood from distant chimneys. All of those memories felt borrowed now, distant. They belonged to a version of me that had died a long time ago. I ate slowly, letting the food settle into my stomach like stone. I thought about where I would go next. Not to a home. I didn't have one. Not to a family. I didn't expect to be welcomed. There was no plan, and for the first time, I didn't feel the need for one. For years, the letter had been my direction, my reason to move forward, the silent purpose behind everything I did. Now that it was gone, I had no narrative to follow, no anchor, but also no more pretending. The truth had been spoken, even if no one had been there to listen. And that was what mattered. Because honesty, I had come to learn, is not about outcome. It's not about being heard, or understood, or absolved. It's not about the other person at all. It's about standing before the parts of yourself you've hidden, even from your own mind, and saying, "This is what I did. This is who I was. This is the truth I will carry, even if it cuts, even if no one thanks me for it." I paid my bill with the crumpled bills I had left. I walked outside and stood for a moment on the sidewalk, breathing in the smell of rain-dampened pavement and wood smoke. The sun had not fully emerged yet, but the light was soft and silver, brushing the edges of the buildings like something cautious and new. I didn't feel new, but I felt real. I walked for an hour without direction, past houses with Halloween decorations already in the windows, past high school students waiting for buses, past mothers pushing strollers and old men smoking on porches. I blended in easily. No one noticed me. That anonymity felt earned, not shameful. I wasn't hiding anymore. I had stepped out of my shadow and into whatever this was. At a bench in a small park, I sat and watched the ducks gather near the edge of a pond. A boy tossed breadcrumbs into the water while his father stood nearby, checking his phone. The boy laughed, his breath visible in the chill, and the sound of it drifted across the surface of the water like something holy. I didn't envy them, but I felt something move inside me, quietly. I reached into my coat pocket again, forgetting for a second, then remembering. Empty. That was the moment I finally understood what I had done. Not asked for forgiveness, not sought pity, not begged for peace, but offered truth, naked and unprotected, and then stepped back. I had spoken without speaking. I had told a story with my feet, with the paper I left behind, with the silence I accepted in return. And in doing so, I had made peace with the one person I had avoided facing for decades. myself.